Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's version of CMI's Leading Lights interview series alongside our 75th anniversary. I'm Ann Francke, the Chief Executive of CMI, and today I'm delighted to be joined by CMI companion Rachel Sandby-Thomas CB. Hi, Rachel. Rachel is currently Registrar of Warwick University, and prior to this, held several roles in government, including Director General in the Department for Business Innovation and Skills, as it was then known, and Shadow Chief Executive of the newly formed, at that time, Institute for Apprenticeships. So welcome, Rachel. Nice to see you.
Thank you. Very nice to be here.
So we've got a busy slate of questions, and I'm going to start off with a rather important one in these times. What do you think the role of values, ethics, and culture is in modern day leadership and management? Does it matter?
Well, I think you won't be surprised to hear I think it matters hugely. And actually, I think, current events are showing how much it matters. I think it's always mattered because, people spend so much of their time at work. They want to work, do something which matters to them. So the values and kind of purpose behind work, I think, has always been really important. Plus the fact, people, as I keep saying, people are not fools. They can tell when actions and values are inconsistent. I think it's always been important. I think it's becoming increasingly important as people become very disillusioned when they see it not happening. And also because I think the generation coming up, all the research into them shows that they are very, very purpose-driven and very values-driven. And I think they will only follow leaders who reflect the values that they hold and who act in that way.
Yeah, and I guess you must see that a lot in your position as Registrar of Warwick, dealing with many, many students, many of whom are of the next generation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, and people can get infuriated because, they kind of obviously hold their views and their opinions with such passion. But I kind of think, well, if you can't hold your views and opinions with such passion at that age, I think it's really healthy that they are so passionate about issues, even if sometimes it can make them difficult potentially to, reason with, when you're trying to do the very, very rational thing, which is, the response generally of management. But actually, I like the fact that they're so passionate. I really like it.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. Obviously, you were young ones too, and when you started your career, I know that you faced challenges in your career, and if you think about the challenges that you face, what do you think is a challenge that people still face, and what advice would you give them in terms of how to overcome that challenge?
So I think the challenge that I personally still face, is this whole idea of what people should be like. It's kind of, I wrap it up under this thing, gravitas, that word, gravitas, which I absolutely hate. Somebody once said to me that they It's a term that people use when they don't want to give you a job, but they just don't quite understand why. They kind of. So way back at the beginning of my career, after a bit of digging, I actually found that I had been marked down in my end of year assessment by people I had never worked with. The people who I did work with allowed me to be marked down because they had seen me giggling in the corridor. So obviously you can't giggle in the corridor and be really, really proficient and competent and intelligent. Can't do that kind of thing. And then it was turned on to me that actually it was my fault that I hadn't impressed the people I'd never worked with, my intelligence, because I didn't go round telling them all that A, I'd been to Cambridge, and B, that I got a double first and all. So that was my fault. But of course, it never occurred to them that I could have done all of that because I'm small, Northern Irish, curly haired. Drives me absolutely crazy. But then it was used, it came up in another context, and it was the word obstinacity, which I'd never heard, which I think is a great word. And I was being asked if I suffered from obstinacity. And in some ways, it's kind of true, because I have point blank refused to dial down my personality just because, I might appear to, lack gravitas. And I think that it's, the whole thing is about, judging people on appearances, not actually on substance of what they do. And I think we do that still all the time. It's either appearance, or it can, of course, be race, it can be sex, it can be accent, it can be all of those things. But it's that forming instant judgments on the basis of essentially nothing.
Well, let me just say, Rachel, that obviously I completely empathize with your experience of feeling that you had to hide your authentic self, or being punished for showing your authentic self, and being, feeling that you've been held back because of who you are, and judgments about who you are. And actually, for our 75th anniversary, we're releasing a report next week. And it's a staggering statistic that says that actually 41% of people we interviewed have been held back because of who they are at work.
I know, it's great, isn't it?
So you are definitely not alone. Your experiences are, very, very common. So what do you do? What advice do you give people to overcome that?
Well, because I probably am quite obstinate, the advice I don't give them is just try to conform. I don't, because, and it pulls so against being an authentic leader. I mean, the two things just are a complete contradiction to each other. So my advice to them is just to be themselves, and to be proud of themselves, and not let themselves change. Because again, the more senior they get, the more their actions and words will be judged, and people will sniff it out. They'll know. They will know. Ironically, I remember going to a woman in leadership event years ago, and I was sitting at a table of very senior women who were trying to get to the next stage, and they had all conformed to the kind of male expectation. It was all very, very kind of city people working in the city. And they were all being told that the reason that they couldn't get on to the next rung of senior leadership is because they weren't showing enough of their personality. So having subdued their personality in order to get on, they were now being told that actually they need to bring their personality out.
So that's a sort of, you can't win.
You can't win. You can't win.
But that advice, be your authentic self and be proud of who you are, I think is very important advice. And we just obviously, you were there. I had a CMI Women conference, and Alison Rose spoke very passionately at the beginning of the conference about the advice she would give herself is be yourself, right? Yes. So be your authentic self, her younger self. She was talking about how she sees how important it is for people to be their authentic selves. And so I think even if it is bringing challenges, it is very important. And ultimately, and we can all do this. If we can't be our authentic selves where we're working, we can always work somewhere else, right?
Oh, quite. Oh, quite. And that was actually one of the decisions I made when I changed and went into government, was because of that. And actually, one of the great things about working in government, certainly when I started, was actually people liked the fact, that I had a personality. They liked it. It was kind of it was valued. So yeah, no, absolutely. And and especially in the current times we're in, people can move really easily. They're in such demand. So, and the other aspect of it as well, I suppose, is that it must take so much energy trying to pretend to be somebody you're not. I don't know how people do it.
Well, there are studies that show that you're absolutely right. If we have to suppress our authentic selves at work, we get exhausted. We tire much more easily. It puts us under a lot of stress.
Yeah.
And it impacts negatively on our energy and our well-being and our performance, because obviously we're investing so much of our internal energy controlling our personality to be something we're not. It's sapping. It's very draining. So that's another reason not to do it.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously you have to be professional, right?
Oh,
but that can encompass giggling in the hallway. I mean,
exactly. You can giggle in the corridor and news headline, whoever knew?
I mean, in fact, laughing at work is healthy, right? We all need to laugh.
And also, it is one of the things that actually does keeps me going. It is, it is how I get my energy, is, chatting to somebody in a queue. They invariably make me laugh, and it can completely change my mood and put a spring in my step until I, go into my next meeting.
Exactly.
Things I really missed during lockdown, actually.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. So, okay, you've worked for some very large institutions in government and banking, and obviously now in education. How do organizations find the right balance between continuity and change in these very uncertain times?
Yeah, it's really hard, especially when they are very large operations. It's a marvelous picture somebody sent me, and I wish I could find it because I would use it all the time, which is a black and white video, probably in the wartime, of a woman changing a tire on a plane as it's flying. And it's absolutely amazing. And that kind of is how I kind of think of it. You're trying to introduce change, but actually you're trying to keep the daily rhythm of business going.
Wow.
One of the things I think is that I think the word change can really be off-putting for people. It kind of makes them fearful before they even know what it is. So quite a lot of the time, I don't actually call change. So I probably sometimes I use the expression change by stealth. Because, and certainly when you start a new job, it's very interesting observing how nervous people can be, because they kind of assume that you're going to come in with an agenda of change and that is going to be threatening.
Right.
And they kind of breathe a sigh of relief after the first year, because actually it's still kind of okay. So
if you don't call it change, what do you call it?
Well, I mean, I know it's a bit hackneyed now, but I like the term continuous improvement. I think, so what I try and do, I think, is talk about what I think we need to do and the kind of place we need to be in those kind of, we need to, constantly just check on what we're doing. We need to make sure that everything we do is kind of like user-friendly, or, takes into account the student experience. Obviously, we need to be as efficient as we think. So we just need to look at our processes, get them as simple as we can. So it's kind of more describing how I think we need to be, rather than putting together a great big flashy change program, which of course, in many ways I would love to do, because it would be, headline-y, any interviews I ever go for, I can, my change program, I had these KPIs. And there obviously are times when that kind of thing is appropriate. But sometimes I think it can just put people's fears and hackles up, and that's completely unhelpful.
Well, you're right. I know some research CMI did a few years ago now that showed that I think something like 2/3 of people feared change, exactly as you're saying, right?
Mm.
And actually but the good news is that 9 out of 10, or the bad news, the same research was showing that 9 out of 10 of those change programs failed, right? But the big reason they failed was this human element. They didn't take into account sufficiently people's concerns around change, and there wasn't adequate communication about exactly what you're talking about, Rachel, which is describing what you're trying to do. So we're trying to simplify our processes or make them more student friendly and put that user experience right there. And actually, that means instead of doing it this way, we could do it that way, and that would probably be better for them. It's taking the time to explain that kind of rationale, and too often people don't do that. And if you don't do that and you're running a change program, often you won't succeed because, right, you might have that nice headliney thing, but you're not articulating clearly what it is that you're trying to do, so you don't take people with you.
Yeah, and also the laugh is and there's another couple of aspects as well, is that if you or depending on how you put it, it can sound as if you're criticizing watching what they're doing now, which makes them defensive, because that's a completely natural state to go into. But the laugh is as well is actually if you ask them what they would like to, if they had a magic wand, what they'd like, they will generally tell you that they want to change exactly what you want to change. Because it's not rocket science, any of this kind of stuff, and they have exactly the same frustrations. And I think that's one of the things that we do really badly generally, or can do badly as kind of leaders and managers, is not actually ask them what they think, because their wisdom in crowds.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so important to involve the people doing the actual work in any change programs that you do, because as you say, they're probably experiencing a lot of the frustrations and have good ideas as to how they might be fixed, right?
Yes.
Or indeed, if you do that kind of thing together, then you can both craft a program that you both believe in, the people doing the work and the managers leading them. And that's when you're going to get better results. So you're right. It's not rocket science, but it happens. It happens too little. And exactly that kind of communication is an important thing in the next topic we're going to talk about, which is still a topic, which is the lack of progress, relatively speaking, for many groups, including women and people of ethnic minorities and people of disabilities. But a statistic for you, again, from our 75th research, a decade ago, there were 40% of managers were female. And here, that was 2012, and here we are in 2022, and it's 41%. But of course, so what can we do? What can we do to, get those missing female managers into leadership and management positions more quickly?
Yeah. So one of the things that I don't think we probably do enough is ask a lot of women who opt out why they opt out. I remember when I was DG Skills, amongst other things, talking about the lack of female engineers. And a lot of the CEOs, obviously all men, were actually really worried about it. And they, had absolutely racked their brains, all sorts of things, etc. So what I did when I went to any kind of events where there were female engineers is I just went and asked them. I said, so why did you leave? Why did you do this? And actually, one of the reasons that I was told consistently, because you begin to hear the same story, so you kind of think that this must be some truth, was because in order to progress, they needed to do stints abroad. And that coincided with them having children who'd started school and, potentially partners with jobs. So actually, they didn't want, at that time in their life, they didn't want to go abroad. So they just stayed at a certain level. So that, I think the pipeline thing is really key. And then, going right back to the beginning of our conversation, there's lots and lots of perception stuff. But one of the points which was made at the conference a couple of weeks ago, which I must say I really enjoyed the conference, it was absolutely great. Was I've just lost my train of thought.
You were talking about what came out of the conference.
I remember. It's actually getting, because when it's females going on about it, I think it can be quite a turn off for men. So I think we need to get, and Mark Price said this, didn't he? We need to get men outraged about this. We need people to speak on our behalf. And one of the things he was saying about the asking, fellow male peers, well, how would you feel if it was your daughter? Is one of the techniques that I have used as well, because they kind of think it's okay to pass over a woman generally, but they would be outraged if it was one of their, bright, gorgeous child. So a lot of that, I think the kind of the stats, having some of those stats to hand and actually armoring everybody we can with those stats so we can ram them home is key too. But it is just so depressing, isn't it? So depressing.
Well, yeah, I mean, and it's true that one of the things that you were saying to make a successful change program is also very important in understanding how to get more diverse and inclusive in your everyday management and leadership, which is to ask people about their experiences. So what do you think? And then listen to the answers, right?
Not rocket science.
No, so that is very important. But, one of the issues, and this is maybe particularly important, and it's come up in some of the areas where people feel uncomfortable. So, for example, perhaps with ethnicity or disability, is developing courage and fluency. So many managers and leaders are afraid to ask, right? They don't, and so how do we encourage people to say, to articulate their questions or engage in conversations?
Yeah, I think this is one of the really, really big issues facing leaders and managers now. And at Warwick, we did a really, really good set of inclusive leadership workshops with Pearl Cadona, who were brilliant, who are marvelous in this space. And one of the lovely, one of the things that all of our leaders were saying is that they are scared. They are scared because they really, really don't want to offend, but they are so scared of saying something which might inadvertently offend. And one of the expressions that Binna came up with was the allowing people to be clumsily awkward, unintentionally, or humanly awkward, I think, or humanly clumsy, something like that. But, we had to be kind of kinder with each other, because so obviously if somebody intends to offend, well, that's a different thing. But most people don't. They fall into it, and actually kind of just educating each other in a kind of more empathetic way, I think, is the way to get people to do it. But it's very hard, and I absolutely understand a lot of the stuff, especially in the wake of Black Lives Matter, etc., was, a lot of the ethnic minorities saying, we're fed up having to explain all of this to you. It's kind of like, when are you going to wake up, and smell the coffee? Why is it always our jobs have to educate you? We've got enough to do, combating all the kind of the direct and indirect discrimination, etc. And I do have a lot of sympathy with that. But on the other hand, the worst thing in the world will be where everybody just kind of goes into their little quiet corners and don't learn and don't educate, because it's just going to throw up all these different invisible barriers.
Yeah, you're right. And actually, many people that we've spoken with as part of this project, who themselves are perhaps Black or disabled, say that they have, empathy, and they would rather have people be, as you said, humanly awkward, and maybe, that you'll say the wrong thing, but they'll be fine with it because they know it's coming from a place of good intention, right? And unless of course it's not, in which case obviously it's a different story entirely. But as you said, most people have good intentions, and it's about not being, don't be afraid to say, gee, I'm not sure exactly how you'd like to be addressed. How would you like to be addressed? Or I'm not exactly sure what would help you, make it easier for you with your disability. Maybe you can share some things if you have some things to share with me, rather than just assume, like what the example that came up in the 75th was, just because somebody's in a wheelchair, people just grab the wheelchair and start pushing it. Well, why? A lot of people in wheelchairs, that is not what they want you to do. That is not helpful.
I know. And, we just have to all be a bit better about saying things in a more direct, non-offensive way, so saying, it's really kind of you, but actually, please don't do that. And the other person not taking offense, because it's so easy, isn't it, to take offense at these things.
And obviously we can't do that. Well, you've already mentioned, obviously, the importance of data, and we're going to come back to that a little bit. But when it comes to really making more progress, which we agree is too slow across all of these characteristics, there's one school of thought that says, well, being disabled is different than being gay or being Black, or unless of course you have intersectionality. You could have somebody who's Black, disabled, and gay. But some people say, well, each group that's marginalized has their special needs and characteristics, and so we need to take all of those into account and measure it and have some targets. And other people say, well, you should treat it all as just one big inclusive way of being. And it's not a black and white question, I'm sure. But what are your thoughts on whether you discretely look at the different characteristics, or whether you try to roll them all up into an overarching program?
I think it's really hard because, the intersectionality makes it really hard. Again, Bina Kandola's book, Race at Work. I think that's what it's called. Really, really good on this, because he's kind of saying that actually the inherent biases or assumptions about a Black woman will be X, but an Asian woman will be different, and the same with Asian men and Black men, etc., etc. So I think it can. I think it's tricky. I think we probably have to do both. Because the mixing everybody up at once goes to this not judging books by cover and all of that kind of thing. And of course, some of it is more, if somebody is in a wheelchair, they're obviously disabled, but there's lots obviously of invisible disabilities as well. One of the reasons why race is such an issue is because, again, it can be very, very visible. But I think we do have to measure some stuff too, because if we don't measure it, how do we know? How do we know that we're making any progress? If we weren't measuring, you wouldn't have your lovely 40 to 41% little horrifying factoid. So I kind of think we probably have to do both. And we just need to keep shining the light.
I think you're right. And obviously getting the data and setting targets, right, for each of these characteristics, I think is important. It is important that that's how we make progress, right? That's why CMI advocates gender pay gap reporting, and we've strongly supported ethnicity pay gap reporting. Because when you have the data and you measure these things is when you can make progress, right? And of course, the other important thing is technology. Technology, obviously, technology advanced hugely in the pandemic. It's helped us all to keep the wheels turning and work remotely, and in many cases be more productive. And it's interesting that many women, ethnic minorities, and people with disabilities preferred actually remote working for a whole host of reasons. One of which was, they could be in more authentic surroundings, and they could better combine their work with their life, and they didn't have to commute and all those things, caring responsibilities, etc. So, so technology can make a big difference. Now, there are other technologies that are emerging, that might, for example, look at the language used in ads, or indeed give managers and leaders a nudge because they're analyzing their promotion decisions and hiring decisions and nudging them when they're being perhaps, biased in some way. So do you think, what's your view? Do you think technology can really help us with this diversity and inclusion journey?
Yeah, no, I do. And I think the using AI to analyze language and things is really interesting. So in fact, funny enough, years and years ago, when I was at HMRC for 14 months, they employed a diagnostic linguistic expert. I'd never known before that there were such things, but that is essentially what she did. She listened, she came to all of the senior team meetings, and she analyzed the language used. And she was able to say to them, these are the three things it told me. And she nailed it. She absolutely nailed it. So I'm sure AI can help with that. I mean, this whole thing about adverts, etc., is really interesting. I was actually reminding my 16-year-old the other day, who was horrified that when he was 4, I was unloading the dishwasher, and he looked at me quizzically and he said, Mummy, he said, are you a boss? And I said, well, yes, because I had quite a large amount of people reporting to me. So I wasn't the ultimate boss, because it was when I was a DG. And I went, yes, I'm not the ultimate boss, but yeah, I am. And he went, that's funny, he said, because I never thought women could be bosses. And, he had grown up with me always working and always the main breadwinner. So his home environment, that it shouldn't have been a surprise, but he was. So where is he getting that from? I mean, where is he getting that from at 4? It must be TV, it must be ads, it must be books.
School,
everywhere, absolutely everywhere.
Well, there is a very big societal issue that, along with addressing workplace issues, we need to address the societal issues, and that's really a really important point. And that's really what you're saying. And it reminds me of an anecdote that one of my directors shared with me, which is that at her son's school on Mother's Day, they had a rhyme, that was something like, my mummy may not have a degree, but she cooks and cleans and makes me tea. So she rapidly wrote to the head and said, you cannot be having the children. You cannot be serious that you want the children to be reciting this rhyme on Mother's Day. So, this is an example of what actually happens. And this was probably 2019. It wasn't 1950. So we do, there is a lot of bias, and, being aware of it, challenging it is important. And what you said earlier, making sure that if you're a man, and particularly in management and leadership, which are the most common sorts of managers and leaders, senior, well-educated white men, need to actually be aware of this and call it out, because it is, of course, a huge business and talent opportunity. And do you think that's really understood? Do you think that people actually buy the business case for diversity and inclusion, or do we have some more work to do there?
I think they do intellectually. Mm-hmm. But I think a lot of these decisions aren't necessarily intellectual ones. They're kind of more inherent ones. There's the whole thing about groupthink and herd mentality, and just instinctively wanting people who look like you, who agree with what you say, instead of actually, really relishing the fact that people have different views. And, diversity of thought, huge. And that diversity of thought is going to come with all of the difference of lived experience and judgment and blah, 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 blah. But it kind of you need to have confidence to hear a diversity of views. And sometimes I kind of wonder whether it is somehow they are kind of covering up a lack of confidence in the fact that they don't want it. Possibly.
Yeah, possibly. And obviously confidence and self-awareness are two underpinnings of successful managers and leaders, not overconfidence.
No.
but confidence and self-awareness, right? Being aware of the impact of your behavior on others, which is another reason for asking people, because
Right.
then you're more aware of it, right?
Well, absolutely. But interestingly, I think a lot of people, because they've been promoted on what they know, are actually really wary of saying what they don't know because they think it's a sign of weakness. So
Yeah.
hence you go into the not asking people stuff and then not knowing what they think. And, the cycle goes on.
Well, it's ironic in that one of the greatest behaviors of inspiring trust, and again, this is some CMI research, but I was reminded of it yesterday listening to Kate Richardson Walsh, the gold medalist hockey player, and her wife Helen talking about their journey. And they were saying how they went from being last in the European Championships to winning gold. And all of that was about rebuilding trust. And in order to rebuild trust, they had to show vulnerability. They had to show that they didn't have all the answers. And they had to do a huge amount of listening to each other and common co-creating of values and how they wanted to behave. And that's the kind of practices that we're talking about here for more inclusive leadership, right? And it is something that when you do it as a manager and leader, you get, people are happier, their well-being goes up, you're more productive. It doesn't matter whether you're in the public sector or the private sector. It makes huge sense, right? So it's very much worth doing. And actually, we're going to come on to talk about COVID in a minute, but I have an article in the Times today on for the Times Enterprise Network, where I occasionally do columns, and this one is about cost of living. What do I do if I can't give my people a whopping great pay raise? Well, what you can do is some of the things we've been talking about here. Be a better manager and leader, and give people things like flexible working or well-being days, or promote community activities that bind them to you and create that sense of common purpose and engagement.
Yes.
And that can be worth more than a pay raise. I mean, I'm not saying it will heat your home. I'm not saying that, but I am saying that, there are other things we can do to combat the cost of living crisis in terms of how we lead and manage others, to make them more engaged.
No, quite. And I remember David McLeod did a great report into employee engagement for the Department for Business back in the day. And he had a list of factors that made for more engaged employees. And actually, salary and money, I mean, it obviously featured on the list, but it wasn't high on the list because their research showed that it gave a temporary, kind of fillip in engagement, but it didn't last. So it was leadership, it was vision, it was training and development, it was feeling included, it was all of those things that you're talking about, which were the major contributing factors to people feeling engaged and therefore productive at work.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, in COVID, we did have to change in many ways, where we worked and how we worked. What have you learned from the pandemic about your own leadership style?
So I think one of the things I learned was that it was okay, and in fact, well received, to say, actually, I'm feeling miserable this week. So normally, I do a weekly email to my staff, which I write, and sometimes there's just jokes, and I can basically tell them what I'm kind of up to. And normally, I try and be upbeat in it, because who wants a miserable leader, so to speak. Well, actually, what I learned was it was okay sometimes just to say, actually, I'm not feeling great at the moment. This is now beginning to get me down. I'm feeling fed up too. And actually, I got a lot of very nice emails back saying, I'm so glad you said that, because it kind of makes me feel okay that actually I'm not feeling great either. So I think that was probably, just not having to be upbeat all the time is probably what I learned.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great learning, and it's okay not to be okay, right? That's one of the main tenets of promoting mental health at work, is that as a leader, you also have to say it's okay not to be okay and admit that sometimes you're not okay. It's again, that showing vulnerability to build trust, right? It's not a sign of weakness, it builds trust.
Yeah. And also I kind of realized relatively early on too that, you know, the need for one-to-ones and actually speaking to people was, you know, absolutely paramount. So they became encased in concrete in my diary. And I started each one by saying, you know, and how are you? How is it going? You know,
Yes.
are you okay? Just to kind of check in, because otherwise we didn't have those cues, you know, because normally if I kind of, you know, have a meeting with all my directors, you can practically tell by observing them whether they're kind of in a good mood, not in a good mood, in a good place, not in a good place, that kind of stuff. But it was much, much harder to do, I found, with everybody working working remotely. The other thing which we did at the beginning of it, kind of tailed off, was, you know, because there was that sense right at the beginning when we thought, you know, might last 3, but probably 6 weeks, you know, that kind of thing, or everybody in it together. So quite a lot of kind of, you know, trying to kind of build up a sense of community and in it together and all that kind of stuff, which lasted for a thing, but then just, I mean, I'd like to think that they do think of themselves as a community, but that kind of that intense period then kind of wore off a bit.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Well, what do you think? Okay, that's some of your learnings and very good learnings, and we've seen that as well. But what do you think we've learned as a society, and perhaps what do you think our political leaders have learned about the importance of management in this pandemic?
Well, I'm not sure about our political leaders, but I think people have realised that, well, going back to what we kind of started talking about right at the beginning, it gave people a window in to others' lives much more than it had before. And actually, that was okay. So I think it's kind of, you know, taught leaders that actually they can open up their kind of lives. They didn't have to have such a kind of a screen between their professional lives and their personal lives. That, I think, has been a good thing. I think it certainly is teaching leaders, managers, that they probably have to manage in a different way, in a kind of outcomes-based way rather than the presenteeism way, which, you know, people should have known before, but probably haven't been as good at it because they haven't been forced to be as good at it. I think it has taught leaders and managers that they need to trust people because they can't see what they're doing, you know. But actually, you know, so what if somebody goes and puts a wash on and gives themselves a break? I mean, we don't tell people they can't go and make themselves a coffee or they can't stop and chat to somebody. You know, we should never be expecting everybody to just sit tied to their desk, whether they're in work or whether they're not in work.
Absolutely right. You know, why not go put on a wash? Why not go pick up your kid from school? You know, somebody told me when they get angry with somebody and they're working remotely, they go out and pull up a few weeds in their garden and they feel better, right? You know, why not?
But also I find that just by taking those breaks, it's actually when my creativity comes. It's when I think of things and allow stuff to digest and then something pops out. So actually my idea of hell during the pandemic was, you know, and I had many of them, days where I'm literally from one Zoom meeting to the next Zoom meeting to the next Zoom meeting to the next Zoom meeting, because I can't think creatively. You know, I think creatively by either having some time or talking to people, and it will spark, and then a little bit of kind of time, just, you know, walking from A to B, and then something will spark.
Yeah, we do a daily walk and talk hour at CMI where I encourage everybody to go outside, walk the dog, or, you know, walk with your child if you have a child at home or a partner. So that you have that thinking time, right? And you can't go from dawn till dusk from Zoom meeting to Zoom meeting. Nobody can do that. It will make you, you know, you'll again, it's exhausting, right? So, we encourage people to plan time in their diaries where they don't have those. So hence that daily hour. Well, okay. I want to talk a little bit about sponsorship and mentoring, and then we're going to get on to some. I have some big questions at the end, and then we'll take questions from the audience. So if you have a question for Rachel, please just put it in the chat, and we'll take as many as we can. But So sponsorship and mentoring or mentorship. How important is it? What role have both of those things played in your career? How do you sponsor and mentor now in that you're in a senior role? Maybe you can share your thoughts with us.
Yeah. So sponsorship has never been part of my career. I don't think. And I have a slightly mixed views on it because I think, well, I suppose because I think, what do I think? How do I say this? So, you know, I kind of believe in merit. I believe people should be promoted on merit. And the fact that somebody's being sponsored and somebody isn't kind of interferes with that notion for me. Though but I can argue, the reason why I'm kind of is because I can argue it both ways, because I can see, but if people are at a disadvantage, actually, they need a foot up. And it probably happens all the time anyway. So it might as well be deliberate. So I can argue it both ways, but it has never been a thing with me. Mentoring, on the other hand, I've had lots of great mentoring relationships, and I try and mentor people as well. So I will always say yes, just so everybody knows. I will always say yes if somebody asks me to mentor them. And I kind of think for me, it's just been that kind of trusted space. Normally it is with people who I probably already know. I very often don't even know what's on my mind and what is bothering me until I start the conversation with them, and it kind of comes out. And it's just people being willing to listen and kind of share their wisdom. I sometimes, you know, their advice, I mean, it is only just advice, yeah. And sometimes, you know, it can be, I would do well not, you know, if I'd listened to my mentor after I had my first child, I would never have had my second child. And I'm very glad I went ahead and had them. So even though it was well meant, it was actually probably quite limiting advice. So it needs to be taken as just that. It is just advice.
Yeah, it's advice, and you're free to follow it or not. So it's interesting what you said about sponsorship. I mean, one anecdote is people, we've been talking about people, you know, the lack of representation of women, for example, in senior roles, and people from ethnic minorities. Actually, one important factor in getting those people into those senior roles can be sponsorship, because they don't put themselves forward naturally, because they don't feel that they would be considered, because they don't maybe conform to what the common accepted notion of a leader is, etc. And for those people, sponsorship, which should be, of course, based on merit, right? You want to sponsor somebody who is very deserving and actually has the merit and is doing a great job, but is maybe not as visible or not putting themselves forward as much, or needs that extra bit of leg up. And actually, most CEOs themselves say that they've had sponsors. So, but of course, what we mustn't, or what we need to resist, is sponsoring people who, again, look exactly like us, right? And sponsoring, you know, looking for merit and looking for good people to sponsor that deserve it, and then, you know, helping them with their career, opening up your opportunity.
Yeah, and of course, I have been lucky that in the past people have come to me when I probably didn't think I was ready for promotion, or wouldn't have put myself forward and said, "Actually, you should give it a go. You should try."
Well, there you go. That's sponsorship. So I want to ask you, before we turn to questions, what does a better, fairer society look like to you, and why?
Well, it's a better, fairer society is one where people have the kind of equality of opportunity, I suppose, and aren't judged or held back by where they come from, any of their characteristics. You know, that's my idea of a fairer society.
And that's exactly what we're advocating in our 75th anniversary report. And as I said, we have a long way to go. I think we're missing over 1.5 million diverse managers and leaders from the management and leadership in this country. So yeah, we've got a lot of work to do, but we've got a lot of good advice coming out in our report, which launches next week, on how to do that. So so thank you so much, Rachel. We're going to take some questions.
Okay.
Thanks for sharing all your experiences and insights. Our first question comes from Lucas. It seems to me that some of the traditional exemplars of leadership, such as politicians, are now all too often falling short as role models. Where do you think young leaders should be looking for inspiration now?
Well, it's a great question. I think that, so what I think is interesting is that the young people, because you learn from bad managers and leaders as much as you learn. It can be a much more painful way of learning, but actually you learn a lot from bad. You promise whatever you do in the future, you will never, ever do that to anybody else. Right. And I think young people are learning a lot at the moment, because they can, I'm not going to be like that. And of course, with the advent of social media and podcasts and videos, they are exposed to a much wider range of leaders than certainly I would have been when I was growing up. And I think they are great at actually looking around them and seeing who they admire and who they don't admire. Personally, I love TED Talks. That might show my age, but I've learned so much about leadership just listening to those lovely snippets of great people sharing their wisdom. So I kind of think there's a wealth of inspirational people out there now, all of whom are much more accessible than they would have been years ago.
It's a great point. And I also love your point about we learn as much, if not more, from bad bosses and bad examples of management and leadership than we do from the good examples, right? Because as you say, you can say, "Ooh, I'm not going to do that."
I promise. I vow.
So it's an excellent point. Thank you for pointing that out.
I'm encouraging people to be bad managers in order to teach.
No, so learn what not to do from some of those leaders that Lucas is referring to there. This is what you not to do. So that's a very important point. So we have a question, an anonymous question. My question for Rachel. When has she experienced resistance based on discrimination, and what tactics did she employ to overcome this successfully? Conversely, when has it not gone as planned?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question, because none of it has been overt. So I have never, to my knowledge, been overtly discriminated against, but it is more this kind of feeling that in order to be as good as, I needed to be better than.
But what about that time when you were marked down for giggling?
Oh yeah, no, that was one. I mean, that was an absolutely blatant one. No, that was a completely blatant one. But I've already said that one. But yeah, no, that was a completely blatant one. Otherwise, it's kind of probably been more hidden. I think. So I mean, what I've just always tried to do is be as good as I possibly can at what I do, and just hope that that's enough. Which I know, again, hoping that you're going to be seen to be doing a good job and get merit. I know it's a very female position, isn't it? That you're going to be. You just hope you'll be judged on.
There's actually a name for it. It's called tiara syndrome, right? It was an American psychologist that came up with that. You expect somebody to put a tiara on your head. It's not going to happen. So you have to advocate for yourself, or that's where finding a sponsor helps. One CEO I know had 3 candidates, 2 men and a woman. The 2 men were jockeying all over the place, going for the job. The woman did not put herself forward. She was the best candidate. He went to her and said, you're the best candidate, and then sponsored her for the next couple of years until she was appointed CEO, right? So it is an important thing. You do need to advocate for yourself or find that sponsor.
No, I must say, I find it I know, but I'm really bad at doing it. Really bad at doing it.
Well, hopefully so that would be my advice to the person that asked that question.
Yeah.
But it is, of course, as Rachel has shared, something that happens to all of us, unfortunately, still.
Yeah.
Next question is from Delith.
Yeah.
I like what Rachel said about her approach to change management. It feels like a low ego approach to me. So rather than shouting about my change program, she just gets on with making improvements. Is low ego leadership valued enough? What a good question.
It's a brilliant question. I'm sure the answer to it is no, not nearly enough. Not nearly enough. But so thank you for the low egoship comment. But it's also, I think it's also because I think it's effective. Because, you know, my view is in the kind of the circumstances that if I was going to do a big, you know, great big change program, it just wouldn't be effective. So it would backfire. So it might give me a headline, but it's not going to give me anything else apart from that. What, of course, it makes it harder to do is actually to actually kind of record practically the differences that you have made. It's harder to kind of, for example, if I was going to go to an interview, talk about them, you know, I can do it. I just need to go away and think about it a great deal more and kind of scroll back over the years. And I find that stuff quite tricky. I tend to kind of play mental tricks with myself. I mean, the first time I ever had to do a self-assessment, you know, I was on, well, practically in tears, certainly on the verge of them, by the time my secretary at the time threw back my self-assessment and said, there's absolute nonsense. I'm not sending it in, you know, blah, 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 blah. So anyway, I took advice. None of it worked until I played a mental trick with myself, which was if somebody was attacking me to my line manager, what would I say to my line manager to defend me? And once I tried it in that way, I thought, well, I would say blah, 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 blah. And I did that. And I did that. And she should tell them that. And once I started that mentality, and actually I felt much better for it. So I need to get myself into that kind of mentality to go back and.
Okay. Well, another trick, so that's a good trick. And another trick you can use is what if you were, you know, this were your good friend that you admire, you know, asking them, you know, asking you, what are my strengths and what have I done? You'd say, you've done so much, right? Because you might be more generous to your good friend than you are to yourself. So both of those, how would you defend yourself? But also if it was your good friend that you admired, you know, what would you tell them? Those both of those can really help. So good advice. So a question from Sylvia. Hi, Ann and Rachel. What do you think are the biggest barriers to middle managers like me being able to really drive inclusion forward in organizations?
So I think, I mean, the answer should be that there aren't any barriers. Sometimes I think people perceive barriers. But, you know, there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to drive it forward, whether it's by setting up a network or by setting up, you know, kind of meetings where you discuss these kind of things or getting in, you know, speakers or whatever. I mean, there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to do it. And, you know, it would be a good thing to do. You probably just need to take the initiative. And I sincerely hope that wherever you're working, seizing that initiative would not be considered or would, you know, be suppressed. I mean, it should be absolutely making you noticed and good for your career, as well as contributing to a more inclusive culture.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think
just do it.
Yeah, and also, you know, start with your own team and your own behaviors. Ask your team how they feel. Listen to their answers. Ask them to ask their teams. You know, ask the people at the doing the most junior roles in the organization. You know, you can be a role model, and should be nothing preventing you from being a role model, because if you have a diverse team, you're going to make better decisions. You're going to get more done.
And so when I was in the department, I kind of gone to talk to some of the fast streamers with my boss. And then they started asking me what I call female questions, all good questions about, how did you overcome this? How did you do this? So we were running out of time, so I did a separate little session with them afterwards. And then I kind of thought, well, I've got my experiences, what I did, but actually I know lots of senior women because they're friends of mine. So why don't I get them to come and talk to them as well? So I started this thing called Cake and Eat It. So you're supposed to bring coffee and cake to it.
Yes, I did one of those for you. I remember.
You did. It was great. And it was lovely, wasn't it? Because it was just informal, no slides, no nothing. It was just you coming to tell your journey. I know, because I learned lots about your journey through that talk. So I find these talks just as inspiring and interesting, I think, as lots of the audience did. But I just wanted to expose people's stories.
Be a storyteller. It's one of the advice, the major pieces of advice that we're putting out in our report next week, and it's great advice. Be a storyteller and encourage the stories of others, because that's how we learn. Rachel, we are unfortunately out of time, but it's flown by. It's been amazing to speak with you. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. Thank you all who listened, and if you are not a member of CMI, but you've enjoyed listening to today's program, please join us. You can find out how to do so in the chat. Thank you.
Okay, lovely. Thank you, Anne. Lovely to talk to you as ever.
Thanks. Take care.